Awesome. So to get us rolling a little bit, I'd love it if folks could introduce themselves in the chat with their name, their pronouns, if you feel comfortable, what ward you live in the district, and if you've ever provided testimony before, live or written, in the budget process, the DC budget process. Yeah. And while folks are doing that, thank you, Shira. I just want to give you a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to spend about 30 minutes here in the main room going over the goals and purpose of testimony and walking through the process of how you create it and how you write it and how you submit it. And then the last 30-ish minutes will be open time for you to start working on your testimony or talking through questions with any of us, with leaders and with me, or like any thoughts or brainstorming that you might have. And if you're already a testimony pro and you don't really want or need the training, although I can attest to it being a very good training, and you just want to start working now and you just want this space to be your accountability time to make sure that you have started your testimony, you can just let us know in the chat and we'll make a breakout room for those folks if that is of interest to anyone. That sound cool? Cool. So please just let me know about that. And otherwise, I think I'm kicking it over to Ben to talk about why we do testimony.
Hey everyone, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Thanks, Jenna. So, testimony. Why are we doing it? Why is it important? What are our goals? But testimony is, excuse me, budgets are really, really important. They're, in big picture, statements and reflections of our values and priorities. You know, sometimes the budget process can seem, you know, really like technical and wonky, but when push comes to shove, it's where like a lot of the most important things that this city council does happens. The city has limited, and when I say limited, I don't mean very few dollars, but there is, you know, not an infinite amount of dollars that the city can spend. And so this budget is an opportunity for them to show what they really care about. I was talking to Shira earlier, and she mentioned how a couple years ago when it was easy for the city council to pass the DC under 3 legislation. They passed it unanimously, but when it came time to actually fund it, you really saw like where people stood, but it was also an opportunity to hold council members accountable to their professed values and goals. So, as I said, the DC budget, city government budget, is pretty large, and there was an excess of $700 million last year. There's no excuse for the city not to fund the things that are really, really important to fund, like housing, like education, all the things that we really care about. So we just need to make sure that happens, and it doesn't happen without us. And that sort of gets us to the goals of testifying. Why does testimony matter? Let me kick it to the crowd for a second. Love to hear your thoughts on why we testify, why it matters. What are the goals that we have when we testify, and perhaps even more specifically, what are our goals from the testimony that we're going to submit in a couple weeks?
Well, I guess I can start with one of the goals is to tell the council what we think are the priorities for the budget.
Totally. Anyone else?
To continue building our relationships with council members and to show up and show who we are and what we care about.
Yeah. Can you say more about like what you mean by the building relationships?
Yeah, I mean, we establish relationships in our kind of not one-on-one, but like individual council member meetings. And when we then show up for testimony, we build on those relationships and say, here's, we talked about this in our meeting, now here we are kind of in a larger sphere to make that same ask. And at the same time, it kind of gets our name out there as JUFJ and establishes credibility. Like, we're not just, out there on Twitter, we're actually showing up and making our voice heard, like here in the room or the virtual room where it counts.
Totally. Yeah, it's one thing to have a we'll call it private meeting with a council member, but it's another thing for it to be public, in the public record and subject to public accountability and scrutiny. One more before I move forward. Okay, so I'll move forward. No worries. Yeah, so Shira and Courtney mentioned some really, really important goals. We want to make sure that council members know what to include and know what their constituents want included in the budget. And it's, as Courtney said, to reiterate what Courtney said, we're building upon our relationships, making it clear that the asks that we present to council members in our more private meetings are to them, and their stances on those asks. Like, will they do it? Will they not? I think testimony is just the fact that you're showing up. You're counted. You're seen. What you say me wrong, but in order for the right things to be included in the budget, we need to make sure that the right political circumstances and the right the right power demonstrations of power, the pressure are there to make it happen. And us showing up is demonstrating that power, is putting the pressure on the council to make it happen. Now, JUFJ has a unique role in the testimony process. First of all, JUFJ is part of a big multiracial and diverse coalition. And JUFJ does skew to be skew wealthier and whiter, honestly, than the city as a whole. But by showing up, we show that there's broad support for the budget asks that we're making. And for better or for worse, the fact that wealthier white residents of DC are on board with something does carry a lot of weight, for better or for worse. JUFJ also has pretty strong relationships with council members and stronger relationships than some of our coalition partners may have. And so, once again, for better or for worse, when we say something to a member of the council, they may take what we have to say more seriously than they would others, and maybe more receptive to it. So just to summarize, this budget process is really an opportunity for JUFJ to make sure that the things that we care about are included in the budget, and JUFJ and you have a really important role to play in making it happen. Just before I kick it to Courtney, I just want to say one last thing, which is, and I've never testified before DC City Council. I have testified before the Texas legislature, and I remember in that process, I just felt so much pressure to make sure that every single word was so precise, was really reflecting what I meant. And as I said earlier, what you say is important, but the main thing is that you're showing up and you're making yourself counted. So I just encourage you all, if you feel pressure, feel really stressed about putting this together, know that you've done most of the work just by showing up, and don't sweat the small stuff. That's what we're here for today, to smooth the edges. So with that, I'll kick it to Courtney.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the JUFJ Housing Security Working Group, as are many of you. So a lot of you are familiar faces. Now that we have some more context on why our testimony matters in terms of accountability and showing power, we'll get into the details of the process and what the next few weeks are going to look like for all of us as we're getting our testimony together. JUFJ will be testifying at 9 different budget oversight hearings, each of which will focus on a different agency or department. The hearings will take place between March 21st and April 7th. So it's coming up, but we still have a good amount of time. And that will follow the release of the mayor's budget proposal on March 16th. And we have a wonderful JUFJ testimony guide put together by Jenna and the rest of the staff. Jenna, would you be able to drop a link to that in the chat? Great. And that guide has a full list of hearings and their dates. And I will refer to the guide probably a bunch of times throughout, because most of the stuff that we'll be going over can also be found there. So there's 2 different forms of testimony that JUFJers can contribute: oral testimony and written testimony. The structure of the 2 forms of testimony is exactly the same. The only difference is that oral testimony is limited to 3 minutes, which is roughly 1 single-spaced page of writing. Written testimonies are also pretty concise. Those should be kept to 2 pages, single-spaced or shorter. For oral testimony, JUFJ will assign out a set number of individuals to testify at each hearing. We really want to make sure that we're sharing space with our partners, especially those who represent directly impacted communities. And so the number of oral testimony from us specifically will be limited, but even though there's a set number, there's still plenty of slots. So don't worry if you want to testify at a hearing, you will have the chance to do that. And for written testimony, it's the more the merrier. We encourage as many JUFJers to submit written testimony as possible. Ben kind of alluded to this, and I'll just elaborate a bit. It's really important to know that you don't need to be a policy expert to write an effective testimony. There's really only two numbers that your testimony needs to include: the dollar amount of the budget requests for the program that you're focusing on, and the number of people it would help, or kind of like a very clear data point on the impact if we have that available. But you really don't need to get too deep into the weeds. We have a lot of policy experts in our coalitions, and that's not really our role as JUFJers. The key to our testimony is to share our values and our personal stories. Once you write your testimony, the next step will be to share it with JUFJ staff to edit. JUFJ staff need at least 5 work days before the committee hearings to review your testimony to guarantee that you'll meet the committee's submission deadlines. And again, you'll have those deadlines in the testimony guide. Editing your testimony after you receive feedback shouldn't be too time intensive. If you follow the 4-part outline that Shira will go over in a few minutes, JUFJ staff will probably only have light edits. So definitely pay close attention as I hand it off to Shira to take that part. And finally, if you're giving an oral testimony, the last step in the process before, of course, delivering the testimony itself is to make sure that you sign up as a witness. Unfortunately, this isn't like super streamlined among all the committees. Each one has a slightly different process. So when staff sends your reviewed testimony back to you, they'll also give you the instructions for how to sign up for your hearing as a witness. And now I'll turn it over to Shira to walk us through the 4-part testimony outline and share the example of her own testimony from the past year.
Thanks, Courtney. Before we do that, I want to just pause for a minute and see if anybody has any questions, because that was a lot of great information that Courtney shared. Just wanted to check if anybody has any questions at this point on just the process of submitting testimony and kind of what that all looks like. Great. Looks like we don't have any questions at the moment, but feel free to jump in afterwards with questions. So I'm going to go through kind of how you put your testimony together. So as Courtney shared, there is a really comprehensive testimony guide that JUFJ staff have put together that lays this whole thing out. But we're just going to kind of walk you through it, but you can go back to that as your resource as you're actually starting to craft your testimony. So the key components that you're going to have in your testimony, and this is true both for oral and written, though with oral it may be a slightly more condensed version, is starting with an introduction of introducing yourself and giving a clear ask, talking about Jewish framing or the values that are connected to your ask, sharing a personal story that is connected to the ask that you're making in your testimony, and then closing with reiterating your ask with that clear dollar amount and basically tying all of your testimony together. So you can go to the next slide. And so that's kind of, for me, the way I think of testimony, just very like, here are the sections and draft my sections. But I know some people are more, think a little bit more visually or more kind of want to connect more deeply with their values and their stories. So this is an alternative to use, or you can use a little combination of both. And this is from an organization called Spaces in Action. And it basically, kind of starts off with thinking a little bit about, who you are. That's essentially that intro, and the values that you have that are really important to you. Why that value is important. How is it connected to you? So again, you can see how this aligns really well with the sections in the JUFJ format. And then thinking about, okay, how is your value being violated today? Although I think in the case of testimony for budget, it's a little more the opposite of more about thinking about how the ask you're giving would kind of enhance that value or promote that value that's important to you since we're being more positive about this is what you should fund rather than don't do X thing. And then thinking about what is a bold vision or solution. And so that's really, what is your budget ask is, we're saying you should be funding this thing because that will have this effect that I think is a really important thing. And then kind of the action is really, again, like reiterating that budget ask. So some people, think this is kind of works with the way that they think, and they like to kind of craft their testimony around this or use this as a piece of crafting their own testimony, especially the storytelling piece of it. So I wanted to share that for people who prefer that. And this is in the testimony guide, so you can look through that. And then in the next slide, though, I'm going to walk through the different components of those 4 components, because that's kind of the way that I had crafted my testimony with using an example from last year. So I'll kind of say what's in each piece, and then I'll walk through what it actually said. And I'll just caveat this by saying, first of all, that your testimony should reflect you, and the way you're going to say it is going to be different than the way that I would say it. I mean, it's the same general components, but your voice is going to be different than my voice. And also, the things we asked for last year, it's going to be a little bit different. So the asks are listed in the testimony guide, and you can pull from there. But this just gives you a general idea. So as I said, you would start with the introduction. So of course, it's important to make sure you introduce yourself. Who are you? I think it's good to say, like, even though this is district-wide, what ward do you live in? Explain your connection to JUFJ, since you are submitting this through JUFJ as, kind of a member. And then clearly state upfront what your ask is. So then on the next slide, this was my introduction from last year, and I'll just read it for you. So my name is Shira Markoff, and I have lived in Woodley Park in Ward 3 for the past 8 years. I am a member of Jews United for Justice's DC Leadership Council. JUFJ is a community of thousands of Jews and allies committed to advancing social, racial, and economic justice in DC and Maryland. My testimony focuses on the need to drastically expand existing rental and utility assistance programs to assist households living at or below 30% of area median income and unhoused individuals and families. Now, I will say that I think the ask this year will be more specific than this. This was kind of the way we were framing it last year. So you may be able to just very clearly there say, I'm asking for the DC Council to give, to put X number of dollars towards X thing. So maybe more direct than that, but you can see that this combines the 3 elements I talked about. And I should say, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any questions, but we can go on to the next one. Jewish framing and values is the next piece. So here you're going to talk about what are the values that your ask is based on. And there in the testimony guide, you'll see there is a list of there's sort of general values, and then there's issue specific values that are really tied in very specifically to, are you talking about housing? Are you talking about under 3? So you could kind of opt to sort of talk more generally, or you could kind of take those values that are listed there for your specific issue, or if there's some other values that really resonate more with you, then you're, of course, feel free to use those. So you can go to the next slide. And I wonder if somebody would be willing to read this. This was the example I had from last year of talking about the values. Is there anybody who'd be willing to read this so you don't have to keep listening to me?
I can read.
Thanks, Charlie.
Jewish tradition teaches that we're all created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. This means that every person deserves respect, loving kindness, and dignity. Jewish tradition also teaches that all people deserve what Torah calls Dei Machsoro, resources sufficient for their needs. These values are a basic foundation for creating a budget that's just. A budget is inherently a set of moral choices showing whom and what we value most. TC needs a budget that promotes the inherent dignity and value of every resident of our city by ensuring that no one has to go without those basic needs.
Thank you. So yeah, so
That's
you can see
lovely, Shira.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. I adapted most of it from the testimony guide, but I'm going to put my own spin on it. But yeah, I mean, I think I at that time like chose more general framing rather than one that's very specific to the issue. But because last year, I think our asks were a little bit more general and a little bit more around raising revenue that which we won't be talking about this year. Okay, we can go on to the next section then. So this is really the heart of the testimony, which is really about your personal story and your and kind of incorporating the ask in there. So what you what you can do is look through the testimony guide. There's a whole list of asks there connected to different issues and decide what you want to focus on. So do you want to focus on housing? Do you want to focus on under 3? Do you want to focus on, I'm forgetting what all the other options are, but there's a couple of them. Excluded workers, I think, is one of them as well. And so basically, you know, you should only be focusing on one of these things per testimony. Now, you are welcome to, if you want to submit to multiple committees, if you're really excited about this and want to write multiple things, you can do that and have different asks. But for each committee that you're submitting to, you'd really just kind of put that one category of ask that's there. So you know, Department of Human Services is going to be more one of the sort of ones related to homeless issues, something like that. So so once you've kind of decided what you're focusing on in that particular testimony, you want to think about what is your personal connection to the ask that you're making. Why do you have a personal stake in this issue, or what life experience or anecdote can you share to show the council why you care about it? And I will say this is something I actually struggled with, because I was submitting testimony last year about more funding to support unhoused individuals, more you know, funding support for affordable housing, and it wasn't something that I've been fortunate I didn't personally experience it. So I had to think more about, my personal story was more about why it affects me, I feel like it's wrong for a city that is like a wealthy city to not be supporting everybody in our city, particularly those who need it the most. And so that was kind of my personal story. So I think, you know, you can kind of think about a personal story in a broad way. It doesn't have to be that you personally experience the thing that you're talking about, but it's more about why it's more connected to your values and what's important to you as a person in terms of that story. So you can go to the next slide. This one's really long, and if anybody is willing to read maybe the first paragraph. If not, I can. Oh, go ahead, Charlotte.
Okay. Every day as I walk around DC, I see unhoused people trying to survive. For me, it is deeply immoral that residents of a city with such abundance and wealth do not have the dignity of a home. As someone who has not been financially harmed by COVID-19 and who has had the privilege to safely work at home throughout, I am saddened and angered by the injustices and inequities exacerbated by this pandemic. The lack of deeply affordable housing and inadequate support for unhoused individuals and families is a longstanding crisis in our city, but the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the problem. We need to fully fund housing and services for unhoused individuals and families now, and follow up with comprehensive policies to address these issues.
Okay, Charlotte. So as I said, so my story was a little bit more about how I feel about the issue and less about kind of a direct experience. But I think it's something that connects at a human level with the issue, and I think that's what's important. And then I don't think we need to go through the ask here. This was just you know, is a little bit different last year, what we were asking for. This is going to be probably a much more concise ask and very specific than what we said last year, but you can see how it kind of went from, here's my story, and like, because of my story, that's why I think the DC Council should address these issues. Can go to the last one. So the closing is just really tying all your points together, say your ask one more time, because it never hurts to remind people of what it is you're asking for. And then, of course, thank the committee for the opportunity to testify, both in or orally especially, but certainly in the written testimony as well. And then this was my closing, which is that the council has the opportunity to use this year's budget to get us on track to a future where no one is homeless, spending their whole paycheck on rent, or getting displaced from the city. This is the time to move towards a just recovery from the pandemic and to set the district up for a better, more equitable future. I ask that the council fully implement the budget recommendations put forth by the Fair Budget Coalition around housing. I strongly believe that DC will be a better place for all of us to live if we ensure that all our neighbors have the resources they need to live their lives with dignity and stability. Please take bold steps to create more deeply affordable housing and to guarantee that both our city and all of its residents emerge from this crisis stronger and more resilient. Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony on this important issue. So that is my example, which thank you all for being a part of it. It's actually a little weird to be sharing it out loud because I only submitted it in writing. But I just want to pause here and see if people have questions about crafting testimony, or if there's other support or resources that you all feel like you would need before we kind of have our open space to begin working on our testimony. And also Jenna has a couple of wrap up things too, but I want to stop for questions first.
Yeah, I have a question. I feel like one of the biggest things I'm thinking about as I start to brainstorm for testimony is how much space different pieces of it merit, and making sure to be clear about who I am and be clear about my affiliation with Jufj and the framing and the Jewish framing and all of that. But I don't know, I guess the meat of it, which is that the third piece, the longest one that you shared, interested if any of y'all that are facilitating this have thoughts on balancing your story with the budget asks, if you're bringing in sort of in the way that Shira, you kind of talked about unhoused folks, bringing in kind of their stories as well. I don't know, it's not such a specific question, but how do you kind of balance that, or how are you thinking about getting all of that in a way that feels like you're giving each one enough space?
I don't know, Jenna, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's going to vary from person to person. I think if, for example, someone's writing housing related testimony and has personal experience either with needing housing assistance in some way, or relying on a DC housing program, or knows people who are and can share kind of generally about that experience, that's great. And to emphasize that as much as possible is great, because it's unique and compelling to share stories. And I think Ben mentioned at the beginning that we're not the policy experts. We have our friends at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute and Fair Budget Coalition who are really digging deep into the numbers, and all of our legal aid partners who really know a lot about the intricacies of the law and how they affect people. That's not really what our place is. Our place is to come in as part of this big multiracial, multi-faith coalition and say this is a thing that we care about. And this is why we care about it. And this is our very compelling story about why we care about it. And that the meat of it, right, is about the personal connection and about our values. And so that's why we include that Jewish piece, is that the values are grounding it. And this, it's the values and the personal story that should take up the bulk of things. As much as possible. I'm not sure if I answered your question very well, Charlie.
My question was kind of rambly, thinking out loud, but
Okay.
Yes, I appreciated hearing that.
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing I'd add, I haven't done an oral testimony to fit in the 3 minutes, so I guess that probably is a little bit different. But for the written testimony, you know, what I shared, I think it was a total of 1.5 pages, and we say no more than 2 pages. So like there really is plenty of space in writing to share quite a bit in all the categories. So you know, I think you don't need to feel like, oh, I have to like super condense my story in order to fit everything in. Like there really is enough space to kind of do all of it.
3 minutes can be a long time. It can be a long
time. Especially if you're like me from New Jersey and we talk quickly. So
yes, exactly.
Jenna too.
Yeah. Yes, Jersey. All right. Sorry. Yes, we have 4 people
Everyone
from New Jersey on
this meeting
call,
is from New Jersey.
Wait, I didn't know.
Oh, wow.
Courtney, sure, I didn't know you guys were from New Jersey, but we'll
talk about this.
We'll have to do some geography at some point and discuss.
Yeah. Courtney and I went to middle school together. That's a fun fact for everyone. All right.
Did we answer Tara's question?
Yeah, I think Tara answered her own question, which is that when you go through the process with JUFJ and you get edits from JUFJ, then like you're very welcome to submit your testimony as like a JUFJer. And so you can say like, I am a JUFJ member, I'm a JUFJ volunteer, etc. And then that's how you're representing more than just yourself. Yeah. Okay. Just some things in closing. When people look at the testimony guide, like folks mentioned, there's a list of all of the issues and all of our asks. We're doing a bigger push on birth to 3 related asks and housing asks this year. So there are separate documents linked in the testimony guide for all of those asks. There are a lot of them. Birth to 3 stuff focuses a lot on teacher compensation and making sure that teachers are getting paid equitably and fairly, and making sure that various programs within birth to 3 are getting funded well, so that they can continue to keep working and making our under 3 kids happy and healthy and learning a lot and well prepared for their future in our education system. Our housing asks are very focused on tenants and on homelessness this year. So lots of stuff about permanent supportive housing, about rapid rehousing, which helps get folks off the street really quickly, and into housing with some pretty heavy subsidies, which is great. Also putting a lot of money into rental assistance and utility assistance to help prevent the influx of evictions that we're seeing since the eviction moratorium related to the pandemic closed or ended. So that's kind of an overview of our biggest asks. We also have an ask around excluded workers who got a little bit of funding in the last budget, but have not actually received it yet. So we would like to see that get out the door. And also to get a lot more money for them, since they didn't get any of the federal pandemic relief that they should have gotten. And then lastly, we want a small change to paid family and medical leave policy to eliminate a waiting week period that is preventing a lot of people from feeling like it's worth it to access those benefits when they need them. If folks have any questions about the issues, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And if I can't answer your question, I'll make sure I can find someone who can. Thank you, Courtney, for putting those big giant documents into the chat. And if, again, if you folks have any questions, please let me know. And then just some like final reminders before we start brainstorming a little bit for the last few minutes here. Like I said earlier, in order to like call it JUFJ testimony or to associate yourself with us, we ask that you submit testimony ahead of time so that myself or other staff can take a look at it and make sure that it makes sense to us and follows the asks and seems compelling. So we will probably edit it, but hopefully very lightly, as long as you include a few things. The Jewish piece is really important to us for a Jewish organization led by our Jewish values. Having clear, specific ask somewhere in there is really helpful. Make sure that we're getting what our coalition partners are asking for. And again, like not being too data driven, too policy focused, to numbers really including only the key numbers, how much money and how many people it's going to impact or something like that, if those numbers are available. And we do ask that you submit 5 business days ahead of time so we can make sure that we get you on the witness list for the appropriate hearing. And so that we have enough time to look through it beforehand, because the rest of staff and I are going to be reading a lot of testimony in the coming weeks. So the more time that we have to do it, the better. Are there any questions about that before we start brainstorming about testimony? If not, I'm going to sit here and start thinking about my testimony and also turn off the recording. But thank you all. And yeah, let's start thinking. And if folks have questions while we're sitting here, please let me know.